And I think about that wilderness in my life, and I think about the fact, the gift, the awesomeness, the hope that God saw me. God heard me. God heard my cries in the wilderness, in my own wilderness, right? And God provided me with life-giving water.
Welcome to our second session of The Way in the Wilderness. I'm so glad to see so many of you tonight, some faces who were here last time and some folks who are joining us for the first time tonight. If we've never met, my name is Pastor Colleen Montgomery, and I'm the Director for Digital Ministries of the Virginia Synod, and I am kind of your host and tech person for this series, and I'm really excited to be with you tonight. The purpose of our time together tonight is to begin to dig into more of the stories, to another story that is leading into our Synod Assembly theme for this coming summer. If there's folks from your church who would still like to be able to sign up, the registration is still open. So feel free to encourage folks to keep signing up and to join us. We have 3 more sessions in the coming 3 months. And as I hinted at, tonight's presenter is Pastor Kelly Bayer-Derrick, who serves as assistant to the bishop. So I'm going to pass it over to her.
Thank you, Pastor Colleen. Y'all, it's so very good to see all of you this evening as we embark on our second Way in the Wilderness here in February. This evening, we are going to hear about the story of Hagar and Ishmael and their time in the wilderness, and God providing them with some life-giving water, and how that narrative kind of, at least for me, reminds me of God's life-giving presence. So I want to thank you all for being present this evening, just in general, for some Bible study, but especially as we, as the Synod, prepare for our gathering at the Synod Assembly this year. So I'm going to open us with prayer. This prayer comes from, I've adapted it from the prayer at the Thanksgiving at the font. So it's grounded in a prayer of baptism and water from All Creation Sings. So let us pray. Holy God, fountain of living water, source of mercy, tender and mighty, your love flows through water, a sign of your saving power. Noah and the animals survive the flood. Hagar discovers your well. The Israelites escape through the sea, and they drink from your gushing rock. Naaman washes his leprosy away, and the Samaritan woman will never be thirsty again. Your steadfast love fills the earth, and we give you thanks. Amen. For us, this is a reading from Genesis, chapter 21, the Common English Bible translation with some updated translation by me. That's the KDBD. So, a reading from Genesis. Abraham and Sarah's son Isaac grew and stopped nursing. On the day he stopped nursing, Abraham prepared a huge banquet. Sarah saw Hagar's son Ishmael laughing, the one who Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham. So Sarah said to Abraham, "Send this slave woman away with her son. This slave woman's son won't share the inheritance with my son Isaac." This upset Abraham terribly because Ishmael was his son. God said to Abraham, "Don't be upset about the boy and your slave woman Hagar. Do everything Sarah tells you to do, because your descendants will be traced through Isaac. But I will make of your slave woman's son a great nation too, because he is also your descendant. Abraham got up early in the morning, took some bread and a flask of water, and gave it to Hagar. He put the boy Ishmael in her shoulder sling and sent her away. Hagar left and wandered through the desert near Beersheba. Finally, the water in the flask ran out, and she put the boy down under one of the desert shrubs. She walked away from him about as far as a bow shot and sat down, telling herself, I can't bear to see the boy die. She sat at a distance, cried out in grief, and wept. God heard the boy's cries, and God's messenger called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, Hagar, what's wrong? Don't be afraid. God has heard the boy's cries over there. Get up, pick up the boy and take him by the hand, because I will make of him a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and Hagar saw a well. She went over, filled the water flask, and gave the boy a drink. God remained with the boy. Ishmael grew up, lived in the desert, and became an expert archer. He lived in the Paran desert, and his mother found him an Egyptian wife. So, Hagar, y'all. Hagar's one of my favorite characters in the whole of the Bible, but she may not be as familiar to everyone. So I thought first I'd make sure to introduce you all to Hagar. We first meet Hagar in Genesis chapter 16. She is an Egyptian girl. She is enslaved to Abraham and to Sarah. So she is a girl, she is a foreigner, she's Egyptian, and she is enslaved. So she is on the margins of society in multiple ways. In fact, some biblical commentators say that her name itself, Hagar, is Hagar, which means the foreigner in Hebrew. So it's possible that even her name, her Egyptian name, has been taken away from her. So she also, she is enslaved, and she is a sex slave in the household of Abraham. Sarah gives her to Abraham so that he can go into her. That is the language used in the Bible. And the purpose of her as a sex slave is to have a child for Sarah, not for Hagar. So her child even is taken away from her, because the child is meant to be Sarah's child, not Hagar's child. And we're told in Genesis 16 that Sarah treated Hagar harshly, that she brutalized Hagar. And Hagar fled. She fled the household of Abraham and Sarah. She liberates herself. Hagar has no say over her own body as it's given to Abraham, and she has no say over the child being given to Sarah. So she liberates herself and she flees to the wilderness. And she's in the wilderness. This is in chapter 16 still. She's in the wilderness at a spring in the wilderness where God finds her. And the wilderness, that's our theme, right? For the assembly, the way in the wilderness. And the wilderness, even the word that's used in Hebrew can mean like natural wilderness, like a pasture or an uninhabited land or a desert, or like the large tract of like parks and uninhabited land around a city. But that same word also means like a figurative wilderness. Like when we talk about the wilderness of our soul or those sorts of things. So she is out in the wilderness and God finds her. And God instructs Hagar to return to Sarah. And that instruction is really disturbing and very troubling. And there are innumerable Bible commentaries written to try to explain and fill in the gaps of what's going on with why God would send Hagar back to her enslaver. But God does. And there is hope in the story, though, because God says to Hagar that she will survive. And it's also cool. It's the first divine annunciation in the Bible. Like annunciation, we might be familiar with that word. We think about that with the angel Gabriel showing up to Mary and announcing her that she will have a child. We get a divine annunciation also with Hagar, where God says to Hagar that Hagar will have a child and she will matriarch a great nation. So Hagar returns to Sarah and Abraham's household. But before she does that, while she's still in the wilderness, this is some of where the songs we were listening to as we got started, the God who sees. God has heard Hagar's cries. God has seen Hagar. And she is the only person in the entire Hebrew Bible to give God a name. Hagar names God. She says, this is Genesis 16, verse 13. So Hagar named the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me, she said. For here I have seen one who sees me. So this enslaved Egyptian girl is the only person in the whole of Scripture to give God a name. El Roi is one, means God who sees. So Hagar goes back, we get more of the story, and then we again meet Hagar in Genesis 21. That's our narrative for tonight, right? Unfortunately, or perhaps expectedly, Hagar is still experiencing abuse from Sarah. And we hear some of that this evening. We hear the story tonight where just before what we started, Sarah and Abraham's son Isaac has been born. And now Isaac has grown, and Sarah is jealous of Hagar or angry at Hagar or something. But what she says is she does not want Ishmael, Hagar's son, to inherit alongside her son Isaac. And Sarah wants Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away, to exile them from the community. And Abraham does this, right? He gathers up some food and some water and he gives it to Hagar and Ishmael and he sends them out. And again, they go to the wilderness. This same word, this wilderness of pastures and deserted land. And while she's out there with her son, the flask of water runs dry. And she's searching for water. Like I got teary-eyed even reading the text, thinking of my own children as she's searching for water, fearing that she and her son Ishmael are going to die because there's nothing left to drink. And so she puts Ishmael down under the shrubs in the desert. And she goes and she steps away from him so that he doesn't hear her weeping and crying out to God, afraid that they're going to die. And again, y'all, again, God hears her cry. God sees Hagar. God sees her. And again, God comes and says, Hagar, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. And God shows her a well. And like, again, y'all were talking about the desert. Like there's no water to be found, right? And God shows her a well. God, in God's immeasurable, unending, overflowing, if we want to use that well language, right? This overflowing love of God protects Hagar and Ishmael. Literally gives them life. And we hear at the end, we heard at the end of the narrative that Ishmael grew up and they lived in the wilderness, and Ishmael has a family and becomes a great nation. And so God has fulfilled all of the promises that God has made to Hagar. And I love this story, in part because I just think Hagar is amazing. In part because, she's got chutzpah, she cares for herself, she liberates herself, she has such deep faith. And also because of God's amazing presence. And I was thinking about this and thought about wilderness, and like how many times I think about wilderness figuratively with this story, like where I might feel afraid, those times when I might feel afraid, those times in life when I might feel like truly my survival is at risk, or the survival of people I love is at risk. Again, as I said, like even thinking about that, I can feel the prickles of the tears in my eyes as I think about my own children, right? And how many times I might wonder, like Hagar, where is God? What is going on? What's happening? Am I alone? What's happening? And the reminder that this narrative of Hagar that tells me that God hears our cry and God sees us, that God is present with us in our wildernesses, that God, much like God saw Hagar, God sees us in all of our wildernesses. And I was thinking about this and the wilderness story in my own life, my own personal reflection. Those of you who have spent time with me in Bible study know I love Bible study, and I can spend a lot of time in the text and the translations and all this stuff. But I also just thinking personally about this story, and I thought about wilderness experiences and those times when I might have felt alone and lost. And the first thing that comes to my mind is when I was in high school. So my family grew up, I am a nearly lifelong Virginian. I grew up in Waynesboro, or just west of Waynesboro and Fishersville, in a farmhouse. And we had gardens, and it was so amazing. And then the summer before I started ninth grade, my family moved to the suburbs of Richmond. So that in and of itself was a little bit jarring and wildernessy. It might seem oxymoronic that the wilderness was moving to the suburb rather than being out in the farm. But for my family, for me, that was the wilderness of moving to the suburb. And so we moved to the suburb, and I was in a new school. And the way it worked in the school that I went to, ninth grade was the second year of junior high. It wasn't the start of high school. So kids had been together already for about a year. And also I was really, 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 really shy, really shy. I'm still an introvert. Most people don't believe me when I say that, but it's true. And I was really, really shy. So I'm the new girl. I'm shy. I'm in this new school. And as often happens when you're a teenager, now we would call it bullying, right? There were people who were bullying towards me. There were mean girls in school. And it was rough, y'all. Some of you may have similar wilderness experiences when you think about your own time in middle school or high school or whenever. And it was rough. And I felt alone. And there were times when I was concerned that my survival was at risk. And I think about that wilderness in my life, and I think about the fact, the gift, the awesomeness, the hope that God saw me. God heard me. God heard my cries in the wilderness, in my own wilderness, right? And God provided me with life-giving water. That God showed me a well. And for me, that well was youth ministry. I've grown up in the church my whole life. I've been Lutheran my whole life. I've grown up in Virginia, and congregational youth ministry, and even more significantly, Virginia Synod youth ministry on a synodical level. Like I grew up, I went to Lost and Found, I went to Winter Celebration, I went to Kairos. Those events, y'all, the people that I met, the people in my congregation, the people in those small groups, the adults, the youth, those people were the ones who showed to me, who gifted to me life-giving water. They were people who reminded me of who I am. And more importantly, they were people who reminded me of whose I am. That I am a child of God, loved beyond measure. That I have been made in God's holy image. That I am one who God sees. I am one whom God hears. They were people who welcomed me in, who made me feel like I belonged. They were people who gave me opportunities to lead worship, to lead small groups, to lead other youth, to just, to be belonging. They were people who provided me with life-giving water. They were the people through whom God said, Kelly, here's a well. I got you, here's a well. And God sees me. And so one of the things that I think about with this narrative, with my own reflection, that I hope for you all, is the reminder for us that we never know the life-giving water we may be providing to someone else in what we say and do and don't say and don't do. Like, I don't know that any of those folks were intentionally trying to be like, oh, let me make sure that I give life-giving water to Kelly, but they did. And the ways that the way you live your life and the way your congregation lives its life can be providing life-giving water, because we are reflections of God's grace, right? That God's steadfast overflowing, again, that imagery of the well that's just bubbling up and overflowing with God's immeasurable love for me, for you, for all humanity, for all creation. Even when we may have been treated harshly, or maybe when we are the ones who treat others harshly, even when we may feel unseen by others, I promise you, I promise you, y'all, God sees you, because God is the God who sees. God is the God who names us as beloved, who claims us, who claims you as God's own, and loves you more than life itself. In the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, God is with us always, and God sees us. I'm so thankful to Hagar for giving us the gift of naming God as the God who sees, right? And God is the God who gifts us with life-giving water. Sometimes in and through other people, or perhaps in and through us, we are the ones gifting others with life-giving water. So I am thankful for the gift of Hagar and the gift of God's work in and through Hagar and her time in the wilderness where God was present with her. So what we're going to do is Pastor Colleen's going to help us, and we're going to read this text again and hear it one more time. Now that I've shared some reflection, we'll go back. I've asked Pastor Chris Carr to read the text for us so we can hear it again in a different voice.
A reading from Genesis. Abraham and Sarah's son Isaac grew and stopped nursing. On the day he stopped nursing, Abraham prepared a huge banquet. Sarah saw Hagar's son Ishmael laughing, the one Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham. So Sarah said to Abraham, "Send this slave woman away with her son. This slave woman's son won't share the inheritance with my son Isaac." This upset Abraham terribly, because Ishmael was his son. God said to Abraham, "Don't be upset about the boy and your slave woman Hagar. Do everything Sarah tells you to do, because your descendants will be traced through Isaac. But I will make of your slave woman's son a great nation too, because he is also your descendant." Abraham got up early in the morning, took some bread and a flask of water, and gave it to Hagar. He put the boy Ishmael in her shoulder sling and sent her away. Hagar left and wandered through the desert near Beersheba. Finally, the water in the flask ran out, and she put the boy down under one of the desert shrubs. She walked away from him about as far as a bow shot and sat down, telling herself, "I can't bear to see the boy die." She sat at a distance, cried out in grief, and wept. God heard the boy's cries, and God's messenger called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "Hagar, what's wrong? Don't be afraid. God has heard the boy's cries over there. Get up, pick up the boy, and take him by the hand, because I will make of him a great nation." Then God opened her eyes, and Hagar saw a well. She went over, filled the water flask, and gave the boy a drink. God remained with the boy. Ishmael grew up, lived in the desert, and became an expert archer. He lived in the Paran desert, and his mother found him an Egyptian wife.
Thank you, Pastor Chris. So a couple of options for you in your small group. One is you can spend some time dwelling in the word, where you take a moment. I invite you to take a moment to silently just maybe ponder things that you might have noticed or wondered about the text. You can also spend time, if you want to, thinking about your own self. Have there been people who have seen you and shared God's love with you? And as the corollary, maybe you have been the one to see someone and share God's love with them. And then also to think of another option is to think about your congregation. Are there ways that y'all as a congregation feel unseen or maybe treated harshly by the world? And perhaps we could flip that too. Maybe there are ways that you feel like your congregation might be not seeing others or treating others harshly. And then to invite, think about your congregation. How does God see you? And how does God share love with y'all as a community of God's people? And then by extension, are there ways that y'all see others and share God's love with them?